Now I'd like to introduce Tim Hollo. Tim Hollo is the director of the Green Institute. He was the founder of Green Music and is a community leader in Canberra here. He's stood for the Greens in the federal election twice. Unfortunately, didn't get over the line. And is also an author of the book Living Democracy, which you may have seen up there, which is a fantastic book with so many good ideas on how to improve our democracy. So I'd like to introduce Tim. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kathryn, and Annette for the invitation, and all of you for coming today. I want to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on land that was violently stolen from peoples who had lived here on this land in diverse nations in peace since time immemorial. Paying respects to all elders, past, present, and those still to come, I want to particularly acknowledge Dr. Janara Goring, who spoke so beautifully last night, and Professor Mary Graham, from whom I've had the immense privilege of learning a whole lot about Aboriginal political philosophy and practice. A politics grounded in respect for the natural world, in respect for each other, and a deep appreciation for coexistence. And it's working towards that living politics, that living democracy emerging from the living world that I want to mostly talk about today. So I think we should be talking about, I was asked to talk about connecting the climate movement and the peace movement. And what I'd like to say is that we shouldn't just be talking about ways of connecting these movements, not just talking about ways of bringing young, energetic climate activists into engagement with peace activism, which is also crucial, not just to see these movements working together for greater power, but to reimagine them both and others as intertwined threads in the crucial project of imagining a better world and living it into being. We need today, once more, the kind of thinking of the leaders of the conjoined peace and environment movements of the past. People like Petra Kelly, co-founder of Die Grüne, the German Greens, who said, "Feminism, ecology, and non-violence belong together and are interrelated in the big and the little war, waged against us as individuals, against smaller countries, against the planetary environment every single day." Re-embracing and re-articulating a politics of interdependence, of mutual respect, of coexistence is how we should build connections between the peace and climate movements and so many others. Now, there are, of course, instrumentalist paths for the peace movement to work alongside the climate movement that are worth raising, because they're important pieces of work and they're ideas that can build the trust and solidarity crucial to the larger transformative project. One is that the climate impact of military services must be counted and challenged. This is a huge source of emissions, equivalent to the fourth largest country in the world if it were counted as a whole. The cause of destruction through that, on a par with war itself, and it's getting almost zero scrutiny. Similarly, a solid piece of work, which we've debated in the previous session, around redirecting military funding and equipment in various ways towards climate disaster preparedness and response, would be, I've no doubt, if carefully constructed, incredibly popular and useful. The climate movement has done a lot of work building networks of people affected by disasters, such as organisations like Bushfire Survivors for Climate Action, for instance. So any work there can and should be done in partnership with groups like that for the greatest impact, both for the work itself and for building that crucial solidarity. There's also crucial solidarity work to be done around the efforts of both movements to decolonise, putting First Nations justice at the core, foregrounding the struggles of Indigenous peoples. From Jabiluka to Adani, fracking to nuclear testing and waste dumps, from Indigenous communities from the Torres Strait to Pine Gap being the first in line to suffer impacts. We must give space for First Nations people to lead. The next step is to learn from their systems of governance to reinvent ours. Because let's face it, as we've heard so much today and before, our systems aren't up to the tasks we're asking of them, whether it's tackling the climate crisis or safeguarding and creating peace. Our Westphalian geopolitics of sovereign states competing for advantage, in which war is the continuation of politics by other means, as von Clausewitz said, and is still believed. Our adversarial and exclusive domestic politics, privileging strength, seeing compromise as weakness, reducing avenues for voices of the people to be heard by demeaning advocacy and criminalising protest. The entwining of both domestic and global politics with rampant capitalism, steamrolling over the pretense of the rule of law in the quest for endless growth, fed by a worldview that normalises constant competition for dominance, institutionalised violence against each other and the natural world. These are the systems that created the crisis we face. How long will we keep asking them to solve it? How long before we shift our focus to imagining and living into being a new world, rather than objecting to certain elements of this one and demanding of those in power that they do things that we know damn well they won't do? How long before we acknowledge that these destructive systems are collapsing all around us? And we can either try to prop them up by treating them as the only option, or watch as they're corroded even further, or get cracking with midwifing the new world that's struggling to be born. I put this challenge to the Climate Emergency Summit in Melbourne in 2020, proposing that the emergency action that we need is the community response to emergency. Mutual aid, sandbagging, distributing clothes and food, self-organising networks of action and support, rather than the emergency response that we tend to get from those in power. Bulldozing communities, sometimes literally, paving the way for corporations to profit, sometimes suspending democracy. We should, I argued, be supporting and working to institutionalise the mutual aid approach, using it to rebuild political and economic systems from the grassroots up, and at the same time withdrawing our consent from the destructive systems of domination. I was asked at that summit, as I always am, do we have time for that? Don't we just need to pressure governments to declare a climate emergency and get on with it? So I put back to the crowd, does anyone think that will happen? Nobody said yes, not even the questioner. And in the wake of COP27, as we've already discussed a couple of times today, where once again, we were treated to a spectacle of global negotiation. Governments who are failing to meet their already far too weak commitments, casting blame on those doing less, sovereign powers unable to imagine a cooperative coexistence instead of constant competition, made even harder by the overwhelming presence of fossil fuel lobbyists. It beggars belief that anyone could still trust that system to solve the crisis. Meanwhile, local communities, city partnerships, all around the world are starting to cultivate networks of action, advising and supporting each other from across the globe. They're starting to build a new grassroots confederalist globalism of cooperative coexistence. They're getting on with the action. Now I put the same question to you. The peace movement, I note, is doing a better job in many ways of imagining a different world than much of the climate movement. And the Charting Our Own Course inquiry and report is a great example of that, very, very much in its democratic process, though, and meaning no disrespect to the tremendous work that went into it, not quite taking it to what I think is its logical conclusion in its recommendations. Because, and we've already been challenged on this quite a few times today, how likely do we really think it is that from within this system, an Australian government might chart an independent course? How likely is it that it might renegotiate or renounce AUKUS, the US alliance, that it might boot out US bases, that it might walk away from the Five Eyes? I think we might be able to get things like war powers reform and end weapons sponsorship of school programs, and those are crucial, important steps. But peace for Australia will always be contingent on global peace. And war is central to the Westphalian system by design. And now into that, we see the rise of autocrats. In countries we expect to be autocratic and in countries we expect to be democratic. We see the trampling of the UN. We see great powers rattling sabres and using the sabres. Do we think that peace is possible without transformative system change? Do we think that changing Australia's behaviour within the existing geopolitical framework is any less impossible than changing the framework itself? To be clear, I'm not saying that we should withdraw from UN processes altogether or stop attempting to pressure governments into changing direction. But I am suggesting that we stop trying to convince ourselves and others that they will, and that we use our advocacy to prove the failure of this system while putting a heck of a lot more effort into building the next system. To once again quote Petra Kelly, we must find a way to demilitarise society itself. We call upon people everywhere never to allow themselves to become accustomed to the idea of war and the preparation for war. We call upon people to build and develop communities of peace everywhere. Communities of peace. Communities of ecological sustainability. Communities of deep democracy. Communities of coexistence. Communities that in this age of consequences are able to not just survive, but thrive. This is a project many of us have been working towards for decades, but we've been distracted from it by a system that insists on its own permanence, convincing us that tweaks around its edges are the only realistic possibility. Well, now with the old world dying, there are seeds of the new world all over the place. From the Fearless Cities Network to Rojava, from grassroots Greens and Independents to renewable energy cooperatives, Mastodon and the online Fediverse to COVID mutual aid. It's through planting these seeds of the ecological communities of peace, cultivating the healthy soils for them to grow in, building connections, community to community, civil society to civil society, that a truly transformative coalescence of climate and peace movements can emerge. Thank you.